The next project I have coming up is going to be two butcher block style countertops. One's going to be 32 by 68 and the other one's going to be 28 1/4 by 27. They're both going to be 1.5 inches thick. Now I'm making these countertops out of a premium grade Douglas Fir that's available at my Home Depot. This lumber's nicer than the regular old 2x4, 2x6 you get, and since it's Douglas Fir, it's a nicer grade of lumber than that white pine you commonly see in the big box store. Now the reason I'm using fir for this is because these countertops are going in a laundry room. They're not going in the kitchen, so they're not going to see a lot of use and potential for wear and tear. I would not recommend using a softwood species if this is going into a kitchen or a place where you're going to be using it more utilitarianly versus probably just a place for stacking clothes and maybe some detergent bottles. So true butcher block is when you have a piece of lumber, you turn it on its end, and only end grain is shown. The reason it's like that, especially in kitchens, is because the end grain, if you slice into it with a knife, doesn't necessarily scrape as much as it will separate and kind of reheal and seal itself, and it's more durable. I'm going to be making edge grain butcher block, so I'm going to be planing all my pieces down, ripping off the edges to make them straight, cutting them into strips, and then turning them on the edge. It's still durable, but not as durable than the end grain, much easier to make, and is totally suitable for a laundry room. Bought these pieces in 10-foot sections in varying widths to get the pieces I wanted, and I'm basically first off going to cut them down into two sections so they're easier to manage in my shop. One for the 68-inch long one for the 27-inch long one, and there'll still be a little left over. I'm going to cut all these pieces oversized and then trim them down to final dimension towards the end. So I rip those down on my radial arm saw. Then I'm going to send all these through a planer, and that's just because the top of these is not going to be super uniform. They don't need to be crazy flat or crazy 90 degrees, but I want to get rid of high spots and low spots so when I turn them on edge and glue them, there's not a lot of hairline gaps. If you are a DIYer and you want to do this project and you don't have a plane, you can use a hand plane. It'll take a while, but you can use one. They used to use them all the time. But you can get away with not planing these. Just spend more time and care picking out flatter pieces. I have made these sorts of countertops in the past without pre-planing my wood, and they turn out fine. You just sometimes have more of hairline gaps in between some of your glue up. I have my finished planed stacks of wood over there, and you can see the finish compared to, this is a piece that was a cutoff that I didn't use, the finish compared to the nice smooth flat finish now of the planed wood. Now like I said earlier, the goal of this is mostly just to take down some high spots. You can see there's always going to be some ridges, some rough areas on this wood. I just want to work with flat pieces so that when I cut this and flip it on edge, there's a minimal amount of gaps between each board. I did 4 passes, 2 passes per side on each board, and I was only removing about 30 seconds of lumber, which equals to be about 1/8 of an inch. So I didn't take a lot off. You could see it's not much thinner than the original. So now what I'm going to do with my pieces is I'm going to rip off one edge off of each piece just so I have a nice straight edge, and then I'm going to use that straight edge against my fence, set my fence to 1.5 inches, and then rip all of these boards into 1.5-inch segments, so that way when I turn them on edge, it'll be 1.5 inches thick. And I think I'm down to 1 3/8 thickness here, which means each strip will be 1 3/8 across the block. With that 1/8 edge super straight, you could see how nicely that turned out. I'm now going to do the exact same thing to the other side, and then with all of these flat, then I could set my fence to 1.5 inches and just send all these pieces through till I have a bunch of strips. So that is all those strips stacked together, and I actually have a piece left over from this one just because it isn't as wide as the other one. And this actually sits probably an extra 1 or 2 wide, and that's just because you could see, especially right here, this one was the edge of one of the boards and it's mostly sapwood, so the color's a little different than the other ones. I'll probably swap that one out. And then if there is a little bow in 1 or 2, I always like to have an extra so I could change them out if I have to. And this is just kind of propped up on my table saw. There's no glue or clamps. You could see how tight all those joints are. There's little to no gaps, and when you put glue and clamps on them, they'll pretty much disappear. So now that I have the smaller ones, I'm going to set these aside and do the same thing to the longer ones. And these, as I did it, I was marking E on each one so I know which one is the edge. It's not a huge deal because this is going to be 1.5 inches thick and they're going to be 1 3/8 wide. You could always measure, but that's close enough that these are going to look pretty square, and it's just easier to have a visual reference to know which side is up. I have enough clamps to glue one of these together at a time, so I'm going to do the long one first. And right now they're the side up I want. I went through each one and picked which side was nicer out of the 2 sides. So before I start, I'll go and flip them all onto this side, this face, put glue on each of them, and then flip them back. I'm going to be using a series of clamps to apply pressure that will squeeze everything together, but then I also use these cauls, which are basically scrap pieces of wood with duct tape so they don't stick to the glue, and you sandwich one of those on the top and the bottom, and I use C-clamps to do that, and that will keep this whole surface flat and it won't bow or cup. If you don't have the proper clamps and you don't use cauls, when you're applying a ton of force this way with the clamps, this whole thing will have a tendency to bow, and those cauls will keep everything flat while this glue is drying. So I let all this set up overnight to a total of about 24 hours, and it's pretty warm out. That glue dries fairly quickly, but because this is such a large surface area, I try and keep in the clamps as long as possible. Sometimes I've noticed if you take these out too soon, they won't stay true and they'll bow a little bit. So now I'm going to take all this stuff off and start using a plane and a sander to flatten out the surface, because even though you use these cauls and all those clamps, there's going to be a little bit of undulation, not a ton. This is pretty flat, and I'll just clean up that top and then trim the edges, and this is ready for the customer. So with the sides trimmed and the top belt sanded, that's about where I'm at. And that sandpaper on that belt sander was to about 80 grit. I'll take this to probably 120, so it'll be a much finer finish. And the customer is staining this and finishing it, which is awesome, because that is one of my least favorite things to do. It saves them money, and then I don't have to do it. So this is almost ready to go.